Hello, today I'm going to talk to you about training and a solution I found to a problem I had a short while ago. The situation I had was a contact centre. We were giving them a new system, so new user interface. And so obviously we had to train the users. Training is very important for a couple of obvious reasons. One is if the users aren't trained in how to use it, they're not going to be able to do their job correctly. And the second thing is that if the users don't get trained properly, the company isn't going to make the return on investment that they're looking for. You know, they'll have an objective of spending a certain amount of money on this new system and they want certain results out of it. Training the end users on how to use the system is going to be very much a part of how you realize those goals. So anyway, the situation was that the contact centre was remote, and actually the contact centre agents were all remote from each other. And this was a new situation for them. And I could see right away that there was going to be a bit of a problem with this. And I'll tell you right away what I spotted, and that is if you've worked with this sort of situation where you're having to train people on how to use a new system, generally speaking, they're all in the same room together and they're sitting side by side. And what happens is if one of them can't quite remember what something does, they'll lean across to their neighbour and say, "Hey, Joe, can you remember what this button does?" Or they'll say, "Chrissy, how do you do such and such?" They'll talk to the neighbours, and in the lunchroom or whatever, they'll mutter about the system and they'll share ideas and so on. And so if you've got users who are all remote from each other, they don't have that means of intercommunication. So anyway, we had some challenges getting the software installed. The IT team were responsible for talking to the users individually and getting the software installed and so on. And we gave them training in the ordinary way, and I mean the ordinary way, as if they'd all been together, as opposed to what I've just said about them being all apart. And one of the consequences was that they were having problems. A significant proportion of the users were having trouble using the system. And we were at risk of not being able to go live on the date that we were aiming for, because so many of the users were having problems. Different problems. It wasn't like there was a lot of consistency about module X doesn't work or feature Y doesn't work. It was a mix of things. So what we did, and this is the idea that you might want to use yourself sometime, is we set up short conference calls. Like it felt a bit like doing a radio phone-in. So we arranged perhaps 3 or 4 sessions in the morning, 3 or 4 sessions in the afternoon, half-hour conference calls, or multimedia calls, I should say, using Teams or Zoom. I think it was probably Teams. So half an hour session and 5 or 6 people invited to each of the sessions. And so and as well as the users who had the problems, I was on the call myself, chairing them, comparing, so to speak, facilitating. And we had an engineer and he was sharing a screen. And we found this really helpful because it meant that the users could talk directly to the engineer. They could express their problem in their own words. The engineer, we were very fortunate to have an engineer who was really good at interacting with the users. And so he was able to resolve some of the issues right away. Some questions you could say, you need to do such and such. We had one user where the issue actually was that their name had been misspelt in the system somehow. And so as soon as they saw the engineer's screen and saw their name on the screen, they could say, "That's not how I spell my name." And that's why they hadn't been able to log in. Now, it might seem wasteful to have 5 or 6 on the call that's half an hour long. But that actually wasn't the case, because although each of the users would come to the call with their particular problem, they all had a little bundle of problems or things they weren't really understanding. And so being on a call alongside other people and hearing their questions and answers help themselves to learn more themselves. And so being on the call collectively like that enabled them all to learn a bit more about the system as well as having their own particular questions solved. Having the engineer on the call as opposed to just a trainer meant that some of the issues could be resolved right away because the engineer knew the system technically very well. And if any of the issues were because they hadn't been set up on the system correctly, he could resolve that right away. Obviously not screen sharing anything that's sensitive or personal, but also he could demonstrate and not just say, oh, there's the third button along on the top right is where you press to do, to log in or whatever. He could show them on his screen, this is what you need to click, and then this is what happens, this is the drop down, and these are some of the options you need to check. All that sort of stuff he could show them and explain. And we found this really helpful. We didn't need to, hardly anybody of the users that is needed to go onto a second call, but if they did need to, we certainly said yes, please do come back, and we actually managed to scoop up all the issues that the problems had by doing this. And I would certainly do that again. It means you've got an engineer occupied for the length of time, but he can be remote. So, I mean, if you only need him for a morning or for 2 hours, if you can buy just 2 hours of his time, then you only need to buy what you need. Took up a bit of my time, and you might wonder what the benefit was for me being on the call. And there's a number of those. And one is to make sure the call goes smoothly. If a user was finding it difficult to describe what their problem was, I could help them because I had my notes from what they'd previously written to me about to say that what their problem was. And it meant I could learn from the system as well, because all the things the engineer's explaining, I'm watching that too, and I'm listening to all of that, and possibly making notes for the future as lessons learned, or possibly just if I have a call from a user who's saying they've got that sort of problem, I know a bit more about what to suggest. And so I think that was a really helpful approach, and I think it was cost effective, and it meant that we were able to talk to the users directly and enable us to go live on schedule, as opposed to what would have happened otherwise. You'd be chasing around the problem and trying to solve the problem, finding it didn't, finding there was another problem. It managed to solve a lot of problems just there in the call. So I would particularly recommend thinking about that approach. Certainly if you have users who are remote from each other, and also even if you don't, it's a good way of tackling individual issues that users might be having. And because it can be done on a Teams call or a Zoom call, it means that the engineer doesn't have to physically come to site. He can do it from his base wherever he is. And there we are, really. As I say, I think training is really important because it isn't just that, without the users understanding how to use the system, you can't go live. But also, if the users don't fully understand how to use the system, it's going to be a hindrance to them. And really, you want to get beyond, your target. You want, the business to get the return on investment from what they spent on the new system. So there we are. So hopefully you'll find that interesting and useful. You might find an application for that yourself, or you might think of some variations on that would suit you better. One other thing that's just crossed my mind is how that might be better almost than having people in person, is because the screen sharing is really effective, because somebody's sitting at their desk or their kitchen table or whatever, and they're seeing on their screen exactly what the engineer is recommending they click and what they do, or they're seeing their own profile on the system to see their name spelt correctly. And it's the screen sharing as well as the chit chat that was really significant. And so if you're talking to people in a large group and just telling them how the solution to their problems, that's very good, and certainly in person is very good. But the screen sharing was really effective because the people could actually see their profile on the system if that was an issue, and also they could see what the engineer was pointing to and recommended they click on. So there we are. So that's something you might find useful. I'd be interested to know if you find other applications where this sort of approach helps, or if you've used this yourself in the past. But that's it for now. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.